told your friend you're not okay? And tell me what's wrong and why you never said you felt that way.
The screen was white, not the bright clinical white of a fresh document, but a hollow, terrifying void that seemed to suck the air out of the room. It wasn't a system crash. It wasn't a blue screen of death. It was the total, absolute absence of a response from the reality he thought he had mastered. He sat in his ergonomic chair, a $1,000 piece of carbon fiber and leather that now felt like a throne of glass about to shatter into a million jagged pieces. He looked at his hands. They were steady, pale, but steady. A lifetime of discipline doesn't vanish in a single second of terror. He looked at the code scrolling on his secondary monitor, a masterpiece of financial architecture, a digital fortress he had spent years perfecting with the devotion of a monk. The code was telling him he was successful. The code said he was the richest man in that silent, high-rise office overlooking a sleeping city. But the reality outside that glass, the reality was screaming in a frequency that his models simply weren't built to hear. It wasn't a simple calculation error. Those are for interns and amateurs. It wasn't a bad guess. He didn't guess. He followed a golden thread of logic all the way to the edge of a jagged cliff. And then he stepped off, fully expecting to fly because the math said gravity had been temporarily suspended for men of his caliber. Now, as the first gray light of dawn began to hit the skyscrapers of Manhattan, he realized the ultimate soul-crushing horror. The numbers weren't just wrong. The numbers had been lying to him for years, whispering sweet certainties, while the foundation of his world was being eaten away by a variable he refused to believe existed. For the average person, money is a tempest. It is a messy, visceral, and often violent explosion of fear, greed, and desperate, uneducated desire. People buy because they are afraid of being left behind. They sell because they are terrified of losing what they have. But for him, for the man the board members called the Oracle of Risk, money was nothing more than high-level geometry. It was a cold, solid shape in a world of liquid chaos. It could be measured with absolute precision, weighed against centuries of historical data, and predicted with the soulless, unblinking accuracy of a machine. He wasn't a gambler. In fact, he looked down on the floor traders and the day trading masses with a quiet, intellectual disdain. He never stepped foot in a casino, not because of a moral objection, but because the odds were rigged by humans, and he only dealt in the pure, unadulterated laws of the universe. He was the architect of safety. He was the man the world's largest sovereign funds called when they wanted to ensure the one-in-a-million disaster would never, ever happen. He was the guardian of the status quo. His mind was a sanctuary of pure probability. He lived in a world where chaos was just a pattern that hadn't been decoded yet, a temporary noise that his algorithms would eventually silence. 20 years of a flawless, upward-curving career were built on a single, unshakable foundation. If you possess enough data, if your processes are fast enough, and your models are elegant enough, the future stops being a mystery. It becomes a destination you've already mapped out. He held the data. He owned the models. He was the ultimate authority in a room full of Ivy League geniuses. If he gave a subtle, almost imperceptible nod, billions of dollars flowed across borders like water following the path of least resistance. If he frowned, the most ambitious projects in the world withered and died on the vine before they could even begin. He didn't rely on gut feelings, market intuition, or animal spirits. Those were the tools of the primitive and the weak. He trusted proof. Hard, mathematical, undeniable proof, and for 2 long decades, that proof had been his God. It had been his North Star. It had never betrayed him. Until the day he found the perfect equation, the one that would eventually become his tomb. The opportunity didn't arrive with a dramatic flourish or a cinematic twist. It didn't come as a whispered tip in a smoke-filled room or a frantic coded phone call in the middle of the night. It arrived as an elegant, unassuming spreadsheet, a series of tabs and cells that looked like any other, but contained a logic so profound it felt like discovering fire for the second time. It was a masterpiece of financial engineering that seemed to have solved the one problem no one else in human history could: the total elimination of volatility. It was a model that appeared to have found a loophole in the very fabric of the market itself. It was immune to human panic. It was deaf to political upheaval and blind to the irrationality of the crowds. 30 years of back-tested historical data confirmed the trend with a correlation coefficient so high it felt like a law of nature, as reliable as the rising of the sun. He didn't just look at it once. He spent months tearing it apart, cell by cell. He ran it through every stress test known to modern finance. He looked for the crack in the armor, the hidden variable, the ghost in the machine that usually haunts even the best designs. But there was nothing. No matter how hard he pushed, the math held firm. Peer reviews from other mathematical titans, men with Nobel Prizes and decades of experience, validated every single line of code. It was a consensus of the most brilliant minds on the planet. In his world, there was no if anymore. There was only a mathematical, inevitable when. But the invisible danger wasn't the market's movements or the shifting tides of global trade. The danger was the feeling of absolute, crystalline security. When you believe you have removed risk from the universe, you don't just lower your guard, you throw it away. You stop looking for the fire exits because you are convinced the building is fundamentally fireproof. He looked into the glowing depths of that model and saw a reflection of his own superior intelligence, his own ability to outthink the world. It was logical. It was precise. It was, quite literally, the safest thing he had ever seen in his entire life. And that was the trap. The math wasn't an error. It was a mirror. It told him exactly what he wanted to hear, and he was too smart to realize he was being lied to by his own reflection. The first 6 months were a triumph of silence and order. There was no drama, no shouting on the trading floor, no frantic late-night meetings with panicked regulators. There was only the steady, rhythmic, and entirely predictable growth that the model had promised. It was beautiful in its consistency, a straight line pointing toward infinity. Every morning at 5 a.m., he would walk into his private office, the city still cloaked in a pre-dawn blue. He would sip his expensive black coffee and watch the numbers tick upward with the precision of a master-crafted Swiss watch. Decisions that used to require weeks of agonizing research, dozens of analyst reports, and sleepless nights had suddenly become effortless. They were automatic, they were safe. After all, why would you doubt a system that is performing perfectly in real time? The algorithm confirmed itself every hour of every day, like a heartbeat that never skipped. Every comma was in its place. Every decimal point fell exactly where it was supposed to, down to the 4th digit. He wasn't just managing wealth anymore. He was presiding over a new era of human certainty. He began to invest more than just his client's capital. He invested his soul. He invested his reputation. He invested his very identity into the belief that he had finally conquered the chaos of the human world through the power of the mind. Outside his window, the world remained a messy, unpredictable, and often violent place. Wars broke out in distant lands, scandals erupted in the tabloids, and nature rebelled with storms and fires. But inside the sanctuary of his screen, everything was under his control. He felt like a god who had cracked the source code of reality itself. He was in absolute, total control, while the ground beneath his feet was silently turning into smoke, one pixel at a time. He had built a cathedral on a cloud, and for a long time he was convinced the cloud was as solid as granite. It finally happened at 4:12 a.m. on a Tuesday. The world was at its quietest, the time of night when even the city that never sleeps takes a shallow, uneasy breath. He noticed an inconsistency, a tiny, microscopic flicker in the live data feed, a deviation of 0.001. It was something that, according to 30 years of data and every stress test he had ever run, was physically and mathematically impossible. It was a ghost. He didn't panic at first. Panic is for those who don't understand the system. He calmly looked for the bug in the code. He searched for a glitch in the hardware or a latency issue in the fiber optic lines. He checked the external data feeds, convinced that some rogue source was feeding him garbage. But the code was pristine. The hardware was humming with chilling efficiency. The source was clean. Then the number moved again, a larger jump this time, then another, then a plunge that defied every law of probability he had ever worshipped. It wasn't a technical error. It was a fundamental failure in the very nature of the logic he had spent his life defending. The system he had built to predict and neutralize risk was now actively working against him, using its own complexity to hide the catastrophe until it was too late to act. It was a feedback loop of digital lies. The model was trying to fix the reality to match the math, but reality was winning, and it was winning with a brutality he couldn't comprehend. In the span of 10 agonizing silent minutes, a lifetime of work, prestige, and unimaginable wealth simply evaporated into the digital ether. There were no sirens. There were no frantic cries for help from the floor traders. There was only the cold, soul-crushing realization that the mathematics he had worshipped like a religion had become his executioner. The bridge didn't collapse because of a storm. It collapsed because the math used to build it never accounted for the weight of the shadow it cast. He sat there, bathed in the blue light of the monitor, watching his life's work turn into a series of zeros. He still wakes up every morning at 4 a.m. It's a habit he can't break, a muscle memory of a life that no longer exists outside of his own mind. Sometimes he sits in the dark and opens his old, battered laptop just to stare at the historical charts from that year. They look normal now. To an outside observer, it's just a dip in a line, a historical footnote in a long-forgotten market cycle. The market has long since moved on, indifferent to his ruin. The numbers are still there, cold, precise, and mocking in their indifference. The destruction he faced wasn't just a loss of money. Money is just paper and ink, or bits and bytes. It can be made again by those with the will. The real destruction was intellectual. It was the total, irreversible collapse of his worldview. How do you ever trust your own thoughts again when the very logic of your existence has betrayed you so completely? How do you walk through a world where you now know, with absolute certainty, that 1 + 1 can, at any moment, decide to be 0? He doesn't have a lesson for you. He's not a reformed man looking for redemption or a guru selling a new path to enlightenment. He has no sage advice on how to invest, how to hedge your bets, or how to live a balanced life. He only knows one thing, a truth that keeps him staring into the dark every night while the rest of the world sleeps in blissful ignorance. He knows something that you haven't realized yet. Something that you are currently ignoring, because to acknowledge it would be to invite the madness in. If the most perfect system ever designed, built by the smartest minds of a generation, could fail a man like him, what on earth makes you think your rules, your plans, and your logic will keep you safe when the math decides to start lying to you?